So welcome back to our second lesson in part 2. Today I want to introduce you to the theory of stupidity by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The theory of stupidity really is not actually one of those theories like utilitarianism and deontology or virtue ethics that normally ethicists believe are part of the moral toolkit. It is rather the kind of a theory of what happens when you don't think about your moral choices. And so in order to introduce you to that, I want to take you on a little road trip to Laurel Hill Park in Secaucus. You will find out soon why I want to take you there, because after you now all submitted your reflection papers, I want to kind of reflect a little bit about what affected me in my life and what biases I bear. And I want to do that before I introduce you to the theory of stupidity and connect those two. So I will see you very soon at Laurel Hill Park. I'm merging here onto the New Jersey Turnpike right now. That's very good. And I will see you soon. And here we are arriving at Laurel Hill Park. And let's park right here with a beautiful view on the Hackensack River. So yeah, back in late July, I came here with my partner to Laurel Hill Park, and as I was driving into the park here, I saw this little monument here, and immediately it shot into my mind, that looks like a piece of the Berlin Wall. And I was rather surprised to find that here. So I investigated a little closer, and indeed it is a piece of the Berlin Wall. As we're approaching it, it is the typical concrete kind of wall with a round thing on top. This would have been the western side in West Berlin, and on the east side you would have had the foot. But this looks pretty harmless, right? The Berlin Wall was a lot more dangerous than that. It was surrounded by barbed wire. There was a death strip. Here we can see the timeline of Berlin, starting with the beginning here. I think this is Khrushchev here, and then we have JFK with his famous saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner." We have the building of the wall further around here, where they built another wall behind the wall. Here we have Jimmy Carter actually coming also to Berlin, and here we have finally Reagan saying take down or tear down this wall, and then finally in 1989 the wall came down.
The Berlin Wall was one of the most intimidating symbols of the Cold War era. Who built the Berlin Wall? Why did they build it? At the conclusion of World War II, Germany was divided into two separate nations, East Germany and West Germany. The western portion was assisted by the United States and the United Kingdom, whereas the eastern portion was assisted by the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital city, was also divided into West Berlin and East Berlin in a similar fashion. For the first several years that the two nations existed, people were allowed to travel in between the two sides. However, as time progressed and conditions worsened in communist East Germany, many people began escaping to the western side. The East Germans were determined to put an end to these defections. In August of 1961, the East Germans ordered that the border between East and West Germany be closed. This included cutting the city of Berlin in half and erecting a border between the two. East German soldiers began demolishing the streets between the two halves and established a temporary barbed wire fence. With the splitting of Berlin, many lives were thrown into chaos. Families were no longer able to visit relatives, and in some cases, East Berliners were cut off from their jobs on the West Berlin side. The East Germans then erected a permanent wall made of concrete, which came to be known as the Berlin Wall. The wall was an 87-mile-long fortified structure featuring 116 watchtowers, dogs, additional chain-link fences, barbed wire, and trenches to prevent vehicles from driving across. It also included a secondary wall on the East Berlin side. The space between the two walls became known as the Death Strip, as East German guards were instructed to shoot anyone attempting to escape. The border between the two halves of Berlin wasn't completely closed, however. There were several checkpoints where visitors could pass into East Berlin, although very few East Berliners were allowed to travel into West Berlin. The most well-known of these crossings was Checkpoint Charlie, and it was the only crossing where Americans and many other foreigners were allowed to pass. The wall stood without contest for 26 years, but in the late 1980s, many Germans began openly criticizing the wall's presence. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan delivered a speech in front of the wall in honor of Berlin's 750th anniversary. In this speech, President Reagan made a bold appeal to the Premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Finally, 2 years later, in 1989, the people of East Berlin could bear it no longer. They began protesting the wall's existence in September of that year. On November 9, 1989, crowds of people approached the wall with hammers, chisels, and other tools and began destroying the wall by hand. The Berlin Wall had endured for 28 years, but it was finally torn down. To this day, the towering and divisive structure remains one of the most chilling and powerful memories of those who lived through the Cold War.
Now, when it comes to my own history, why is this important? Well, I was born in 1961 in Hamburg, Germany. The wall was built up on August 13th, 1961. So I grew up as a German, always with the consciousness of a divided Germany into East and West. It has always been that way for me, and it was kind of scary, especially. There was always a constant fear about the Soviet Union coming in and destroying Germany or starting the next war again within our territory. But of course, the wall itself is also a result of World War II. And with that, we have to go even further back to the story of Adolf Hitler and Second World War. As a German growing up in Hamburg, there were several things that were pretty deeply ingrained in me. One I mentioned already, the fear that the Soviet Union might come in and start World War III and take over Germany. That's one thing. The other thing is also that we felt very guilty about what happened during the Second World War. Mind you, it's only 15 years after the end of the war that I was born. And even though I did not take part in what happened during that time, I still felt the burden about it. So I felt guilty about what happened to the Jews that were put into concentration camps and to the destruction that happened around us. I myself was born into a city that had only 17 years before been destroyed by about 80%.
The night fire became a weapon. Hamburg, 1943. For 8 days, British and American bombers unleashed over 9,000 tons of explosives. Temperatures soared past 800 degrees Celsius. Oxygen vanished. suffocating people in underground shelters. Entire districts were erased overnight. More than 37,000 civilians were killed. They called it the firestorm, a storm so hot it melted streets and turned glass to liquid. This was Operation Gomorrah, when fire consumed a city.
Part of my family was already in Hamburg during that time and experienced the air raids that were flown in July of 1943. And so as I grew up, I was asking questions about my family. You know, what happened during the time when the World War happened. And so I remember specifically my maternal grandmother, whom I will introduce to you right now. Here is my family tree. For our purposes, I want to introduce you to two people in this family tree. Starting with myself right here, I want to go to my maternal grandmother. This is my mother right here, and my maternal grandmother Irmgard Neef right here. Irmgard Jene, my maternal grandmother, was 17 when Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. When the war started on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, my grandmother was about to turn 22. She then had two of her children and was 27 when the war ended. So she'd kind of lived through all of this time. She was an adult during this time. And when I asked her, well, did you not know what happened to all the Jewish people, that they were rounded up and put into concentration camp? What did you do during that time? She would oftentimes say, very sad, yeah, but I didn't know, we didn't know this happened. Or she would say, what could I have done? There was nothing I can do. And she kind of didn't shrug it off. She felt guilty about this, but she was helpless. There's nothing I could have done. I didn't know. We didn't know this was happening. And then I want to also introduce you to my paternal grandfather. Now let me introduce you to the second person in my family tree. So we'll move from my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, back to myself first. And this time we go up the line to my father, and from him to my paternal grandfather, Ernst Reinke. Now he was definitely a lot older than my grandmother. Born in 1889, he was only 6 months younger than Adolf Hitler himself. But he was definitely an adult already to both World War I and II. He was 25 at the beginning of World War I in 1914. At that time he was a missionary in German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, which was a colony of Germany at the time. By the end of First World War, which was also lost by Germany, the Allied forces came in and dispossessed Germany of their colonies. And so my grandfather, who was in German Southwest Africa, was taken into prison as a prisoner of war into England. There he was pretty successful, actually. He had a sponsor who saw some talent in him, who sent him to seminary, and so he got his full degree to become a pastor. And with that he came back to Germany. He was 44 when Hitler took power in 1933, serving as a pastor, and 50 years old by the beginning of Second World War. By the end of the war, he was 50 years old and continued to serve as a pastor still in Hamburg until he died in 1960, only about 6 months before I was born. But I never had the opportunity to meet him or to even ask him some questions. But I was curious, of course, about how he lived through all of those times. And I was very upset to learn that my grandfather actually was a staunch German Christian. That was the faction of the church that supported Adolf Hitler. it was always ingrained in me how the travesty that was, and I always thought that as a Christian, how could you stand by and watch people taken away into concentration camps and being killed? How could one even stand up and preach on the pulpit that Hitler is God's given person on earth to finally liberate Germany and put Germany first, be above all of the Allied forces that had put such heavy reparations on Germany after World War I? How could he stand up in the pulpit and preach that Hitler was a good man? That was hard for me to take. When you think about these two reactions from my maternal grandmother, who just didn't know, and what could we have done, and my grandfather, who was older at the time and who was all in on the Hitler movement, makes you wonder how people react that way. I would like to see myself that I would be standing up for justice, that I would want to stand up for the people that are being victimized, that I would want to stand up and protest and do the kinds of things that would prevent these things from happening. Well, here is where I would like to introduce you to an academic hero of mine, also German, born in 1906, so a little bit younger than my grandfather or even Hitler, but somebody who was standing up towards the Hitler regime. His name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was also a theology student, studied theology, actually came to the United States in 1930, studied at Union Seminary, although he felt like that the students here in America weren't really taking things very serious. On Wikipedia we read that during Bonhoeffer's time at Union Seminary, he met Frank Fischer, a black seminarian, who introduced him to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, where Bonhoeffer taught Sunday school and formed a lifelong love for the African American church. He heard Adam Clayton Powell Sr. preach the gospel of social justice and became sensitive to the social injustice experienced by racial and ethnic minorities in the US, as well as the ineptitude of churches when it came to bringing about integration. He was captivated by the sermons he witnessed in Negro churches, and he formed the belief that God's commands were carried out. The originally nationalist Bonhoeffer later changed his views after seeing All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a movie about First World War, which shows the horrors of war. Later in life, he favored the views of pacifism, which promoted love for all people and placed a high value on each individual's life. Bonhoeffer became involved later with the ecumenical Christian movement, which eventually led him to resist Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. When Second World War was raging on, he considered a really difficult moral question. He became part of the resistance to the Hitler regime as more and more Jews were taken into concentration camps and killed. He was wondering if it was moral for him to be participating in an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler, which then he decided to be part of. Even though he knew that as a Christian it was wrong to kill someone, but the question was, is it not more wrong to stand by and watch that individual kill thousands of people and you just stand by and do nothing? His choice was to act and to be part of the resistance. Unfortunately, that attempt did not succeed. There's actually a movie about that or two where Hitler was at a card table to watch, over the maps to see the war progress, and one of his officers placed a briefcase with a bomb underneath that table. Unfortunately, the table was such a strong table and Hitler had moved around to the side just in time, that when the bomb went off, it did not injure Hitler. Of course, as a result, after that, all of the people in the resistance were rounded up and held in prison for several months. Eventually, Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging on April 9th, 1945, less than a month before the end of World War II in Europe. While Bonhoeffer was in prison, he wrote many different things. He wrote some poetry, he had some song to his fiancée, but he wrote one important thing, which is also an article that contained the theory of stupidity. Bonhoeffer could just simply not understand how the German people, who were otherwise known for their philosophies and their inventions and their academic successes, how they can succumb to such horrible things as Hitler, atrocities that Hitler committed. How is it possible that the people in Germany allowed Hitler to do all these things without standing up and without actually gaining anything for that themselves? And so he wrote the theory of stupidity. Here's how it begins. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy to good than malice. One may protest against evil. It can be exposed and, if need be, prevented by use of force. Evil always carries within itself the germ of its own subversion, in that it leaves behind in human beings at least a sense of unease. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplishes anything there. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's judgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied and, being easily irritated, becomes dangerous by going on the attack. For that reason, greater caution is called for than with a malicious one. Never again will we try to persuade a stupid person with reasons, for it is senseless and dangerous. Well, what do you think? Does that make sense? Maybe respond in the next discussion about your thoughts on this.